couple more. There we go. Good morning, everybody. If you are here for navigating local policy to advance community change, you're in the right space. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, apologies for the slight delay this morning, but we're going to get rolling in just a minute and it's going to be great. So Alexis and Kate, do you want me just to roll through our quick little CHTI and then I'll pass it off to you to take over? Okay, perfect. I am a program associate with the Community Health Training Institute. We are a project that is a partnership between the Massachusetts Department of Public Health and Health Resources in Action, which is a nonprofit based in Boston where we all work. And I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves in just a moment, but we want to thank DPH for partnering with us and allowing us to offer you this training for free. We also want to shout out our friends at MPHA, Alexis and Kate, who are going to be your awesome trainers today. They are here to share their wonderful knowledge and their expertise with you, and we're so excited to have them on board. I'm just going to give my colleagues a chance to say hello, and then we'll pass it off to your trainers, and we'll get going. So Jasper, feel free to jump in.
Hi, it's good to meet you all. I think I see some familiar faces in our training audience today. My name's Jasper. I use they, them pronouns or no pronouns. And like Tanayo, I'm an associate here on this project. Also sometimes a trainer, but today we have the wonderful ability to sort of guest host our friends from MPHA. So I'll pass it off to Eli.
Thanks, Jasper. Good morning, everyone. My name is Eli Adler-Cohen. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I am an administrative coordinator here on the Community Health Training Institute team. Tanayo and Jasper hit the nail on the head. All I have to add is that I'm really excited for this morning and for this awesome training. So welcome, and I'll throw it over to Alexis and Kate, I think.
Awesome. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. For those of you we don't know, my name is Kate, and I am the graduate campaign intern here at MPHA, and I will be co-facilitating this morning with my dear supervisor and colleague, Alexis Walls, who is our assistant campaign director. Before we get into it, I will kindly ask that everybody rename themselves to include their pronouns if you haven't already. And in the chat, if you could drop your name, your organization or affiliate, and one thing that you are looking forward to this summer, because our official first day of summer is coming up next week. I will also give a quick friendly reminder to mute yourself unless you are speaking, just to avoid any background noise during the training. And we've realized that this is a 3-hour training, so please feel free to go off camera as needed. However, we do hope to see lots of your faces and have some really great engagement today. If you have any clarifying questions as we go along, you can enter them in the chat. And without further ado, I will pass it off to Alexis.
Awesome. Thanks, Kate. So as folks are still entering your name and organization and pronouns in the chat, I just want to pause and do a little intro on MPHA and just who we are, in case some of you are not familiar, before sort of sharing an icebreaker and then going into the agenda. So for those who are not familiar, the Mass Public Health Association is a statewide nonprofit that does public health policy advocacy. And what that essentially means is that we advocate for the fundamental building blocks of public health. And we do that most frequently at the level of state government, looking at the Massachusetts legislature. And so I will flag that this training, although some of you might be coming in from other states, is primarily going to be focused on thinking about things with the Massachusetts legislature. However, there are many sort of tips and tricks and other things that we will talk about that will be applicable to folks who might be doing or interested in advocacy work in another state. So I just want to put that out there. So welcome to folks who maybe are clicking on from places outside outside of Mass. We work on a variety of issues. We are a public health organization. As many of you know, there are many different things in our world and the environment that impact public health. Currently, just so that you know, in case you're interested in getting more involved with us after this training, some of our priorities this legislative session include local public health infrastructure, affordable housing, and transportation infrastructure, particularly in communities outside of the greater Boston area. And so we're really excited to share with you what the things that we know, but also recognize that there are people who are coming to this space with varying levels of experience. And so if you are somebody who has experience advocating and doing lobbying work, please feel free to add some of your experiences into the chat, or perhaps even raising your hand as we go along, because we want to make sure that we're kind of incorporating all those experiences in the training today. Without further ado, we are going to go into an icebreaker activity. And so for our icebreaker today, we thought it might be helpful to do a little bit of level setting. So again, we know that you all are kind of coming in with different levels of experience when it comes to advocacy within the State House. And so what we thought might be really helpful is for us to actually take a look at who your legislators are. And so perhaps what we can do is put the link to the masslegislature.gov website in the chat. So we will follow up with that. And what you will do is you're going to go to this website. You're going to enter in your street address, your city or town, and your zip code. And then you will learn who your two legislators are. Who is your Massachusetts House rep and who's your state senator. So we're going to first do this, and then that's going to lead us into our icebreaker activity. And so I am going to, in a minute, stop sharing my screen so that you all can get to work on that. I will just flag the two people that you see on this slide are actually my state legislators. And so we have Senator Sal DiDomenico, who is on the right, and House Rep Mike Connolly, who's on the left. These two are my legislators. And so I just thought I would add those pictures in there as you all are sort of doing this work on your own. But why doesn't everybody go ahead to the website and find that for yourselves? And thank you to Nayo for including that link in the chat. Once you've done that, once you've identified who your legislators are, if you even just want to pop those names in the chat, that would be great, so that we can just sort of see the spread that we have within this room. Yeah, yeah, Senator DiDomenico is pretty great. Callie. All right, Luciano has this. All right, nice. This is great. I love that we have a great geographic spread so far. This is wonderful to see. Keep them coming, y'all. Wonderful. All right. All right, so as we have folks continue to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up my screen again, and I'm going to share a little bit about our activity and what we're going to be doing together. So now that you all know who your legislators are, we want you to really know who they are. And so we're going to do a little bit of sleuthing on the internet, and we're going to get to know our legislators a little bit better. For some of you, you may already know things, you may already know your legislators really well. And so this may just be a matter of finding information that perhaps you don't know about them. For others, you may not have even known the name of your legislators. And so this will all be new. And either way, I think it's going to be really exciting. But what we're going to do is we are going to answer some questions about our legislators. So what we'll do is we're going to break off into smaller groups. And in our groups, we're going to do this activity independently, but we're having you break off into groups in case you want to sort of share what you're finding as you identify it with the folks who are in your group. So you're going to be aiming to answer 4 questions. So now that you have who your legislators are, you're going to pick one of them, and you are going to try to find what their career background is, what are 2 bills that they've recently sponsored or filed? Are they chair or vice chair of a committee? And how long have they been in office? So those are the 4 questions we're going to be aiming to answer. And what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to go to my screen here. Whoops, did not mean to do that. I'm going to go to my screen here and I'm going to show you all just how to navigate the website to find that information for yourselves and where you can identify this information before we break off into our groups. Okay. So, all right. So you all should be able to see my screen. Can I get maybe thumbs up if people can see my screen? Okay. All right, awesome. So I mentioned that Senator Sally Domenico is one of my legislators. And so we're going to his page here. And the questions that we have, I'm just going to show you how I would go about finding this on the masslegislature.gov website. So the same website that you went to find your legislator is the same website you can use to find this information. So you're going to click on one of your legislators. And once you get to their page, you can find quite a bit of information here. So thinking about this first question, what is their career background? The masslegislature.gov website included this nice feature fairly recently that some legislators have, not all, where you can thumb over and find their biography. And so I can go over and I can skim through his biography and I can see, here we go. Prior to his election to the state Senate, he began his work in public service by serving as a city councilor. He was chief of staff to a former state senator, and then he also worked in the hospitality industry, right? I may not have known that before, but now I know that by looking at this page here. I'll say if you can't find it on this website, if their biography is not updated, you can just Google their name and find their campaign website and typically find career background fairly easily. So that's how you go about finding the first. For the second question of what are 2 bills that they've recently sponsored, under your legislator, you'll see these tabs here. And the first tab is bills. You'll click on that and you'll be able to see the first list that comes up. You can see what they've sponsored and co-sponsored. To sponsor a bill is essentially to file it. So it's saying that you are one of the leads on that bill and you and your team have worked together to craft the bill and to file it within the legislature. And so that's what that first tab is. And co-sponsor are things that maybe one of their colleagues filed that they support. So you'll be looking for the sponsored tab and you'll just pick maybe 2 bills that seem interesting to you. So that's the second question. The third, are they chair or vice chair of a committee? You'll go over to the committees tab, which is right next to bills, and you'll see the list of committees that your legislator participates in, and you'll be able to see pretty clearly whether they're a chair or vice chair. So you can see here that Senator DiDomenico is chair of one committee and vice chair of another committee. And then the last question that we want to answer here is how long they've been in office. And we can do that by going over to this box, this drop down menu here, where it has the current session. We're in the 193rd session. And you can see and scroll down to see when their first session was. And so Senator DiDomenico's first session was the 2011 to 2012 legislative session. So he started in office in 2011, right? So that's how you can find that information. Does anybody have any questions before we break off into our groups to answer these questions, which Kate very helpfully put into the chat? And if you have any questions, you can just raise your hand or come off of mute. All right, seems like people are clear on what we're doing. So why don't we go ahead and break off into groups. HRIA team, I think that maybe 3 to 4 people per group is probably a good split. And so why don't we break off and then we will take perhaps about, let's take 8 minutes in our groups to do this activity, all right? There we go. All right, so I think we have most of everybody back, or at least almost most of everyone back. So why don't we just do like a very quick debrief. maybe we can get 1 or 2 volunteers to just sort of share what was something that you learned that was perhaps surprising to you about one of your legislators, or that was really interesting. And then if others can maybe put some of those things in the chat, but if we could get 1 or 2 people to sort of share something that you found surprising or interesting when you were doing your homework on your legislators. Kali, I see you're clapping. Are you raising your hand or are you like saying like you found really great things?
I was trying to raise my hand and I've been on Zoom this long, you'd think I'd know how to do that. I'm happy to share. So I looked up Representative Hogan, Kate Hogan. She is the Speaker Pro Temp, which I did know, but I have met with her several times, but I honestly had never done this. So this was a great activity. I found really interesting. I work in our Department of Public Health, and she has been a real big supporter and has put a lot of legislation out there around public health. So that was interesting.
That's great. Thanks, Kali. And yeah, I love that, you know, even when you've been working with someone for a really long time, you can learn new things about them. And it's really, I will say, helpful as well, as you're thinking about how to be really effective in talking to your legislators. The more you know about them, the more effectively you'll be able to craft your arguments as well. And you'll be able to understand what issues they really care about perhaps the most. Like Kali mentioned for Rep. Hogan, understanding that, you know, perhaps public health issues are something that she cares a great deal about. So thanks for sharing. And why don't we get Ciara to go next?
Hi, so I work in Charlestown, and so I'm very familiar with the reps and the senators and local city councilors and everything. But I live just north in Malden, and I actually just moved to a different part, so I didn't know who my reps were. And I thought it was super interesting and not quite like surprising, but Representative Oltrino does a lot of sponsoring and co-sponsoring of bills regarding education, whether that's racial equity curriculum, transparency when it comes to charter schools, because Malden's known for their charter schools, their public schools. And I think it just kind of tracks, I guess I would say, that, you know, Malden's known for really being ahead of the curve on education, and unsurprisingly, there's a lot of different bills about, you know, education in Malden.
Thanks for sharing that, Ciara. That is really interesting. And it is always great when you do work in one area, but perhaps live in another. You know, there's a tendency to like know a lot about the folks in the area you work, but it's like, oh, wait, what about my own legislator? So yeah, thanks for sharing that. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're just going to talk very briefly about what our plan is for today and what we're hoping to talk about. So we've sort of broken this training up into 3 different sections. One is thinking about legislative structure, another is process, and then the last is legislative engagement. And so what we're really hoping for by the end of this is that you all will feel comfortable with sort of understanding how policy is passed in Massachusetts and where there are sort of key opportunities to get involved. You'll be able to identify strategies for engaging with state policymakers, and also know how to find active legislation in the Massachusetts State House, which you all have already started doing with the research and you've done on your legislators and what types of bills they have sponsored. So that's what we're going to be doing today. And I just want to share this framework with you that we at MPHA use to think about effective strategic advocacy. And we say public health advocacy because we're a public health organization, and we believe that with all of the issues that you all work on, whether it's substance use, whether it's transportation, whether it is education, right? All of these things impact public health. So I would say that we are all public health advocates, the fact that we're all in this room wanting to know more. But a framework that we often use to think about advocacy is something that's kind of built on insight that folks who have done this work in the past have sort of shared. And that is really, in order to be effective and strategic in our advocacy, it's about 5 things. It's about getting the right information, which is typically sort of the issue or the policy that you want passed, to the right person or people at the right time, using the right format or method, and we want it to come from the right messenger. So those are the 5 things that we're really talking about here. And today, we're really going to hone in on numbers 2 and 3, the right person or people and at the right time. But we're going to really touch upon all of, at least like 2 through 5, we'll touch upon all of those things. So that's what we'll be doing today. And Kate, I will pass it off to you. Would you want to share your screen, Kate, or do you want me to share? What's easiest?
I think if you continue sharing, that works for me.
Awesome. I'm just going to make this bigger for folks. Okay.
Thank you. All right, so now that we have done our sleuthing on our legislators, we are going to learn more about our legislature. And we are going to get into the processes and the structures of our governing body here in Massachusetts. Can you go to the next slide, Alexis?
Yes. Well, actually, I'm even wondering, Kate, before we go to the next slide, maybe if the question of the next slide is something we kind of pose for people and see if people have thoughts themselves about what the legislature does or what the role is.
Sure. So we want to hear from you all about why you believe the legislature is important. And feel free to pop in the chat or come off mute if you want to volunteer.
Thoughts on why the legislature is important. So Monica has kicked us off. Without the legislature, laws would not get created and passed. Thanks, Monica. Any other thoughts about why the legislature is important? Ciara says we're all subject to legislation that's passed, so we should be as involved as possible. Valentina says representation. Power and influence. Yep. Awesome. Kate, I'll take us into our next slide.
I think you all hit the nail on the head discussing the laws, the process of having a law passed in the state, providing oversight, representation, power and influence, funding was another that was mentioned, and you are all correct there. In short, our legislature is made up of our decision makers, and they are our window into state government. Their job is to listen to us, the constituents. I know for a lot of folks, there is apprehension about contacting a legislator in favor or opposition of a bill or an issue that you care about, but really voicing our opinions in conversation with them is just helping them to do their jobs really well. Next slide, please, Alexis. So we want to hear from you all about what you may have contacted your legislator about. We heard from our pre-survey that some folks are more comfortable with having conversation with their legislators. Some folks have not as much experience in that area. And we also saw that you care about a wide variety of issues from food access to mental health and local public health. So we will pause for a minute here. Again, if you would like to raise your hand or pop in the chat, something that you have contacted your legislators about. And for folks who may be with us from out of state, please feel free to chime in too.
Hey, can you repeat the question?
Yes. Is there something that you have contacted your legislator about before?
Okay, thank you.
I see the Fair Share Act, free school meals, affordable housing, childcare and emergency housing. What else do we have? Early education, HIP, the RTA advancement bill, a close one to Alexis's heart, I know, and all of us at MPHA. Anti-tobacco, vaping. Awesome, guys. Thank you for being so active in the chat.
Is there anybody who would just want to share very briefly, especially all the different ideas that you all put in the chat, what that experience was like, talking to your legislator about one of the issues that that's maybe important to you? I'm especially interested, the folks that have done work around early ed, maybe Dora. I don't know if you'd be okay with sharing what that experience was like, or what it is that you were trying to get your legislator to do.
Yeah, sure. I used to be a family advocate for Head Start, so we used to do a advocacy day. We'd go to the State House and bring parents with us and kind of help advocate for the program and for funding. And so, although I don't do that work anymore, I'm a case management coordinator here at South Shore Community Action Council now. Early ed has always been very near and dear to my heart. And so, you know, it was just, we didn't always get to talk to them. Like a lot of times we would go in and talk to the aides, but you know, we had packets and the kids would make artwork and we'd bring them, and you know, it was always fun. The next year we'd see the artwork on the walls and stuff. So it was kind of fun. So, you know, and I think that it's a great experience for the Head Start parents to learn that, you know, they are constituents and they are, and their voice is heard. And you know, it's kind of neat to see a sea of you know, people kind of going into the State House on one particular day and kind of visiting all of their reps and stuff. So that was it.
Thank you, Dora. And I'm glad that you made the point too about meeting with the legislative aides. I think a lot of times folks get discouraged when they meet with an aide or they receive a response from an aide as opposed to meeting with their legislator directly. But we know that aides can be really great resources, and sometimes they can be like your biggest advocate right in our legislators' offices.
And Kate, I think we have one more hand up with CR, so maybe we get that and then we can move on to the next activity.
Thank you. I was just thinking, so the coalition that I work in, it was initially a substance use prevention coalition. And I was like trying to rack my brain thinking about what we talk about. But for example, actually next week, we're going to the State House because there is a bill up for creating overdose prevention centers to hopefully decrease overdose deaths, increase access to treatment, and just kind of learn more about that and kind of advocate for that. So that's something that we'll hopefully be supporting as a coalition, and it's next Thursday.
Awesome. It's great to hear that a lot of you are already doing such wonderful advocacy in your communities already. Alexis, are we ready for the next slide? All right, so we are going to get into another activity here. We are going to break down the legislature a little bit further in this next portion of the training, but first, we want to test your knowledge. Don't worry if you are somebody like me who has a little bit of testing anxiety. We're not being graded on this. We are not keeping score, but we are going to do a series of Zoom poll questions about the structure and the processes of the state legislature, just to see where all of your heads are at. All right.
All right, so team from HRIA is going to get us started, and these are going to come up as poll questions, one at a time. So we'll answer one at a time together.
So the first question we have here is, how many state reps do we have in MA? See a lot of people going for 150, 160. It's really cool to see this update in live time. All right. Okay. Looks like everybody has answered. Great, Alexis?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think most people have.
Okay, great. So I see that we have 46% that have voted for 160. That is our leading answer. And Alexis, I'll keep these, I'll save the answers to the end when we're done with the series.
Oh, no, we can answer one at a time. Yeah.
Okay, great. So you guys hit the nail on the head. We do have 160 state representatives in Massachusetts.
And just for reference, for you all, with the 160 state representatives, that's about one representative per 40,000 constituents. All right. Are we ready for the next question, Kate?
So our next question is, how many state senators do we have? Ooh, some people are answering already. That was quick. All right, I see people voting for 80, 40, few 55s. Almost there. We'll give another few moments for the rest of folks to vote.
I think we're good, Kate.
Okay. So the leading answer on this question was 80, but in fact, we have 40 state senators here in Massachusetts, and that is about one senator for every 160,000 constituents. So far less senators than we have representatives in the state.
All right.
Next question is, how long is a legislator's term? Looks like we feel strongly about this one. We have around 50% of folks who answered 2 years, which is the correct answer.
I do just want to flag, even the legislators' terms are 2 years. Some of the folks who say no term limit, it's understandable why you would say that, because legislators can run for as many terms as they want. And so we have some folks who are really career legislators and have been in office for years and years and years. So it may feel like there's no term limit, but they do every 2 years. We have elections for legislators. And I think we just have one more question left, right, Kate?
Yes. How often do our legislators meet? So in our 2-year sessions, are they meeting year round, every 6 months, 9 months? Some. Give one more moment. All right, so it seems like answers are a little more split here. The correct answer is that they are meeting year round. And that ties into our opportunities to meet with them too, because although we do have strategic moments within the 2-year sessions in both the bill and the budget cycles, which we will get into more about later, there's truly never a bad time to meet with your legislators. They are meeting year round. It is great for us to meet with them year round too, to speak about the issues and the bills that we care about.
And I just will bring into here, especially given that we might have folks joining from other states, this varies and this differs state by state. So if you are in Kentucky, if you're in Virginia, if you're in any other state, this may not apply to you. And I will say that this is something, to Kate's point about us being able to really meet with our legislators sort of year round, is a really special thing in Massachusetts. There are many states where the session is much shorter. And I think the fact that we have legislators serving year round in 2-year sessions means that there's just more time that we have to be building relationships and moving them on issues that really matter to us. So wonderful. All right. I'm going to share screen again. Sorry, Kate. All right. So going into the next thing, so we've talked a little bit about what the role of the legislature is, right? Like, why does the legislature matter? We've talked about how it's structured, how many legislators there are in each of our legislative bodies, you know, how long they serve, et cetera. But what I think many of us probably want to know is, how is power held within the legislature, right? Who holds the power within the legislature? And so we just want to share a little bit more about what this looks like within the Massachusetts State House. And to do this, we're going to borrow from an analogy that a former colleague of ours, Andrea Freeman, who now, I think there was someone from the Public Health Institute who had registered for this training. I don't know if they're here, but she's now with the Public Health Institute of Western Mass. But one of the things she always said that I really loved is she compared the legislature and power within the legislator to thinking about cool kids within like a school. When you think about like your cliche high school and sort of the cool kid crowd, that is kind of like a good analogy that she often uses. And many of you may be familiar with the image that's on this slide from the movie Mean Girls. But the reason we talk about this is because, you know, even though every legislator gets a vote, right? Just like every student in a school might have an opinion that matters, we sometimes see this thing that happens where there is a smaller group of folks who are kind of determining what goes, right? Just like in a school, you might have a smaller group of folks who kind of set trends within the legislature. Even though every legislator has a vote, there's a smaller number of legislators that get to decide what actually goes to the floor for a vote. And so thinking about how power is distributed within the legislature is really important when we think about wanting to have influence over the legislative process. And so we break power down in a few ways. And I just want to note, we're going to talk about formal power. I will also note that there's sort of informal power within the legislature. And so there are people who might have official leadership positions, but then there are also folks who might hold power who may not have an official leadership position, but maybe they have a relationship with someone who does, which makes them a power player. And so we can talk about the official positions, but I will say, and this is just kind of like a plug for, and we'll talk about this later, why it's so great to partner with organizations that do this work full-time, that do legislative advocacy full-time, because you can maybe learn some of that information around kind of like how some of the informal power is held within the legislature. But when we think about formal power and leadership within the legislature, there are just a few things that we want to make sure you all kind of walk away with. So both the House and the Senate have leadership positions, and the two that you should probably be most aware of are Speaker of the House, who is sort of the head honcho within the House, and the Senate President, who's kind of head honcho in the Senate. These positions have the ability to do things like set the agenda and priority for the session. And they also do things like appoint people to leadership positions within the legislature. So folks mentioned committees earlier. You looked and saw, which of your legislators might hold a committee position. It is House and Senate leadership that determines and appoints people to those positions of leadership within committees. They decide who the chairs are, right? So there's a lot of power that's sort of held within those positions. And then their seconds within either body are the majority leader in the House and the majority leader in the Senate. And so when you're looking on masslegislature.gov and you are looking at legislators, there's a tab that allows you to look at the leadership positions within the House and the Senate. And that's how you can really see, who holds perhaps some of the most power, who's closest to the Speaker of the House or to the Senate President. And so these positions are really important because they have a lot of power in deciding what actually gets to move through the legislature or not. The other way that power is held within the legislature are looking at our committees. And so within the legislature, there are several bills filed every single session. And those bills are often divided up based on subject area. And they go into a committee that corresponds with the subject area. So for example, and this is something that Kali mentioned in the chat and Kate sort of seconded, is the RTA advancement bill. So one of our priorities at the Mass Public Health Association is ensuring that people have the right to move within their communities. And a really big part of movement is public transit, but public transit outside of the MBTA service area is fairly poor in many communities. And so we work within a coalition to really think about how we can advocate for a policy that would increase access to transit in RTA or regional transit authority service areas. And so this is a bill that we filed. It's the RTA advancement bill. And that bill went into the Joint Committee on Transportation because it's a bill that has to do primarily with transportation, right? So as the session goes on, after bills are filed, there is a decision that's made around which bills sort of go into what committee. And it's that committee that's really the first place that a bill needs to move through in order to advance within the legislative process. So our committees have a lot of power and can kind of like serve as like a gatekeeper almost for what types of bills kind of move through within that subject area. I just want to go to this second slide here so you can see a sampling of some of the committees that we have within the legislature. They vary from healthcare financing and elder affairs to the Joint Committee on Housing, Labor and Workforce Development. And we also see committees that are sometimes added to the legislature as issues arise that it makes it seem as though, there's a specific committee that needs to really be thinking about this issue. So an example of this, at the onset of the pandemic, there was a joint committee on COVID and emergency preparedness and management, I believe it was called. I think it's now gone to just being called the Committee for Emergency Preparedness and Management. But that was a committee that was sort of new, that was erected in response to the pandemic. We had the Joint Committee on Racial Equity, Civil Rights and Inclusion that I think was added in as a committee during the last session. And so these can also be fairly flexible, but there are many that kind of remain the same over time. And I also just want to note that some committees have more power than others. So for example, Ways and Means committees are committees that make a lot of decisions around how state revenue is spent. So there's a lot of power there, right? The folks who are appointed to those positions hold a lot of power. Healthcare and financing is another committee that tends to hold a lot of power because of the types of bills that go through those committees. And so that's just just to give you a better understanding of how power is distributed within the legislature. And then the last, I would say, power broker that's really important for us to name is you, the constituent. And so I just want to pause here for a moment to see, you know, why do people think constituents hold power within the legislature? Why would the constituent be named as a power broker here? And people can feel free to either take yourself off of mute, raise your hand, or put something in the chat. Why might the constituent be considered a power broker? Kali says we can vote people in or out of office. Karen says because we pay taxes. These are great ideas. Any others? Jihan says we guide reps towards the issues in our communities. Yeah, these are all really great. I think that the two that I really want to just kind of emphasize here are that you all are right. Legislators are ultimately accountable to constituents because they are voted into office by constituents and similarly can be voted out of office. And so that is sort of a natural incentive to listen to folks that are in their communities. And then the second, I think Jihan hit on the head, which is that, you know, legislators and their staff can't be experts in everything, right? You all saw in the activity that we did where you did sleuthing on your legislators, you saw what their careers were before going into office, right? Some were attorneys. You know, I mentioned that Senator DiDomenico was somebody who worked in the hospitality industry, right? We might have folks that are teachers. And so their career backgrounds that they had before going into the legislature might mean that they know a lot about one thing, but they may not know a lot about many other things that impact your community. And so it's really, really essential for legislators to be hearing from constituents about what the needs are truly on the ground. And for those folks who hold sort of expertise in different issue areas, which many of you on this call do, it's important to be engaging because you know probably a lot more about substance use disorder, or you know a lot more about transportation, or you know a lot more about youth mental health than a legislator or their staff might. And so they're also, they have an incentive to listen to the constituent because there's a lot of expertise that constituents hold that legislators really need to hear in order to make wise decisions. And then we also, the last thing I just want to say about the constituent, and the reason we name the constituent as a power broker is that, you know, it can be really frustrating and discouraging sometimes when you're working on something and you don't see the movement, you don't see the change happen within the legislature. But one of the things we also have power to do as constituents is to organize and to mobilize in numbers to really put pressure on the legislature to pass the policies that we want to see, which can be a long process. It's not something that's easy. It's not something that's quick, but it is something that we have the power to do. And so it's absolutely another important sort of power broker to name when we think about the legislature. So we are actually about to head into a break. But before doing that, I just want to check in to see how are folks feeling? Are there any questions or particularly clarifying questions, something that maybe we've shared that doesn't make sense or you want a little bit more clarity on that folks want to ask before we go into our break? All right. Well, we'll stick around just in case there is something that folks want to ask, but I believe we can go into perhaps, let's say a 10-minute break. So let's break for a little bit. Wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So we have kind of gone through the first portion of this training and focused on the who piece, right? Because we said effective strategic advocacy is about getting the right information to the right person or people at the right time. Wow. using the right method or format and having it come from the right messenger. So those are the 5 things we said are important. Again, the right information is really what's important to you, right? What is the policy? What's the issue, right? What's the information that you really need to get to a decision maker to have them give you what you want, right? So that is going to be really dependent on what issue you work on, and we'll have some examples later where you get an experience bringing the right information. But so we didn't talk as much about that, but we did talk a lot about the right person or people. So when we talk about legislative advocacy in Massachusetts, we know there's a Massachusetts legislature, we know what their role is and what they do, we know how it's structured, and we also know how power is held within the Massachusetts legislature. And so now we're going to talk about the right time. And in order to do this, we're actually going to do an activity. And I'm trying to think, we decided to make this a game time decision, whether or not we want to do it as a large group or whether people want to break out into small groups. And, you know, I feel like maybe we should just take a poll. So we have an activity where we essentially have the legislative process. We have a jam board. We could just use one as a big group, or we can use many for small groups. And this jam board has different steps of how a bill becomes a law in Massachusetts, and they're not in the right order. And what you all would be doing, we'd either be doing it all together or in small groups, is rearranging it to see what order we think is correct. So we'd be doing that as a big group or as a small group. And then we talk about what the right process is, like what is the actual sequencing of events that's important to know here. And so wondering from people how folks feel. Can I get maybe in the chat, if you want to do like everything is one big group, can you just put large group in the chat? And if you want to do it in small groups, just put small group in the chat. So large group or small group. Okay, all right. We have most people saying large, so we are going to do a large group activity for this. I will say the deal that we're going to make, and I'm going to put my hand out and pretend that you all are going to shake my hand. The deal we're going to make if we do a large group is people have to participate. All right. So if we do large group, that means everyone kind of has to be sharing ideas of how you think things should be rearranged. So can I get like maybe a virtual shaking of hands in agreement? All right. Thanks, y'all. All right, awesome. So let's do this as a large group then. I am going to share my my Jamboard screen. Just give me a quick moment. Just give me 1 second. Okay. All righty, so I'm going to share my screen. Can I get some thumbs up if you all can see my screen? Okay, the Jamboard. Wonderful. Okay, so let's do this. So you all can see the bill process. We have 8 sticky notes here, and they're kind of scattered a little bit. Let's think about how we can put this in the correct order. So we're thinking about, in Massachusetts, how does a bill become a law? And so what I would love is, I think it'd be a little chaotic if I shared the link with everybody and everybody started moving things. And so what Kate and I will do is we will shift things around, and you all will sort of just tell us where you think things should be shifted. So is there anybody who sort of wants to take a go at what you think the first step in the process might be?
Alexis, can you make your screen a little bit bigger?
Yes, I can. Let's see here.
If you do Control+, that usually works.
Oh, that's a good shorthand. I didn't know that. Let me try.
Somebody taught me on Zoom once.
Oh, perfect. Oops. Okay. I think is that a little bit bigger and more helpful for folks? Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Okay, so Lovely says the first step is bills filed. Kathleen says representatives and senators are assigned to committees. Any other thoughts here on what you all think might be the first step? Callie says session begins. Nan says legislators co-sponsor. So we have a lot of different ideas that people are putting in. Emily, okay, so now we have a few people saying session begins as the first step. Okay. All right, y'all. I think we're getting to a little bit more of a critical mass. So I'm gonna shift this then, and I'm gonna put session begins here. I'm just gonna put this here, this down here for now. All right, so session begins, and Kathleen is getting on board with what other people are recommending. All right, okay, team, we got our first step. So first step we're saying, and I'm not gonna say what's right or not, but first step we're saying is that the session begins. Okay, and Tanayo, thanks for putting that in the chat. Tanayo says, folks can also zoom in on Zoom, and you can go to the top of your screen where the green bar is and click view options and Zoom ratio. So you can also control that yourselves, which Tanayo, I didn't even know was possible. So y'all are teaching me things. I appreciate it. Okay, so we have our first step. What about the next step? What comes after session beginning? What do you all think comes next? We have Karen who said reps and senators are assigned to committees. Luciano says bills divided by committees. Lydia, bills are filed. Emily, bills are filed. Okay, there are a couple of different ideas. Maybe we get some others to sort of add ideas into the mix. Kali says bills are filed. Dora says reps and senators are assigned. Any other thoughts? I think so far the one that we have bills divided suggested by a couple of people, and we have bills are filed suggested by a couple of people. Okay. All right. So we have more folks saying bills are filed. As that's happening, we're just going to shift it. Why don't we shift bills are filed? Thank you, Kate, in place for second for right now, because that's where majority are saying they think comes next. Okay. Anybody strongly opposed to this? Anybody want to petition to put something else here that you feel very strongly about? Okay, all right, so we have our second step. What do you all think comes next? So if you're saying that the session begins and then 5,000 to 7,000 bills are filed, which I'm not telling you what the right order is, but that number is correct. I think there were something around 6,000 some bills filed this session. That's a ton of bills. And another reason why it's really important for people to be involved in advocacy, because if you're a legislator and staff and you're reviewing that many bills, that's really hard, right? You need to hear from people what is a good idea and why. So just want to put that in people's minds. But we're saying the session begins, 5,000 to 7,000 bills are filed. What happens next? What comes after that? Of the different steps we have here on the Jamboard. All right, so Kali says legislators co-sponsor. Jihan says bills are divided into committees. Okay. Emily says it's either bills being divided into committees or reps and senators are assigned to committees. All right. So committees so far and bills divided are like the top two. Okay. So why don't we get these two? So we have bills divided and committees assigned. Why don't we get both of those and kind of put them side by side? I think I'm seeing more bills divided. So why don't we do bills divided and then reps and senators are assigned to committees based on what people are saying. Thanks, Kate, for orchestrating on the Jamboard. All right. So I think, Kate, based on what people are saying, can we let's do bills divided and then reps and senators are assigned to committees, and then we can put these other options at the bottom here for now. Okay. All right. Kathleen says, not sure if this question is appropriate at this time, but do legislators ask to be on certain committees or are they assigned? If assigned, assigned by whom? Kathleen, that's a great question, and we can respond to that right now. I would say that yes, legislators do kind of have in mind, you know, what their passions are, what they're excited about, what their district cares about and what committees they want to be on. So I don't know what the specific inside process looks like, but I would assume that legislators, just like they might have bills that they want to prioritize or budget items that they want to prioritize, I would assume that they similarly share with leadership what committees they want to be on. So I am almost sure that that is something that happens. Although, you know, you asking for something doesn't mean you're going to get it. And so, especially, right, thinking about what we said about power, if you're someone who maybe doesn't have the best relationship with leadership, you might ask for something, but you may not get the posting that you want. And so those requests certainly do happen. And the assignments are made by, you know, it's actually a good question. I believe, so I know that chair positions are made by leadership, right? So that's made by the Speaker of the House or the Senate President. Deciding who actually goes on to the different committees is a good question, because I don't know if that is leadership or if that decision is then made by the committee chair. Does anybody else know? And feel free to take yourself off of mute if you do know. If not, that's something, Kathleen, that we can look into, and we can maybe respond back with the HRA team so that they can send it in like the wrap up email. But yeah, the committee chairs, that is assigned for sure by leadership. But who gets into which committee, that I'm not as sure about. That could be a decision of the speaker of the House and the Senate President, but it also could be something that the committee chair decides. So we can get back to you on that. Of course. All right, so we have the group's consensus on the first 4 steps. So session begins, a ton of bills are filed, bills are divided into committees, and then representatives and senators are assigned to committees. What then comes after that? So after they're assigned to committees, okay, I'm seeing co-sponsorship by 3 people, and there haven't been any other ideas put in yet. Okay, Kali agrees. So why don't we shift that around? And Kate, if you drag that one, I can drag this one. And we could do legislators co-sponsoring bills as our next step. What about after co-sponsorship? What happens after that, do you all think? Okay, Emily says hearings are held and committees provide favorable or unfavorable reports. Ooh, hearings, it's unanimous. Let's do hearings next. Okay, and then we have 2 last steps, which are leadership moves favorable bills along and floor votes take place. What do you all think? Okay, leadership moves them along is the majority so far. Okay. And then that would make, no worries about the caps, Karen. I just read it as you're really excited to participate in the activity, and I appreciate the excitement. All right, and then votes come last then, it seems, based on people, the consensus of the group. I'm going to stop, well, actually, no, I'm not gonna stop sharing my screen yet. I'm gonna put my gallery mode on so I can see you all. Does this seem good to folks? Like, are folks happy with the order that's kind of been laid out by the group? Maybe we can get thumbs up, either an actual thumb or a Zoom emoji thumb, if you are content with this. All right. Okay, I'm seeing some head nods, some thumbs up. Okay, all right. Why don't we stop sharing our screen? Uh-oh, actually, wait, hold on. We got some folks. Lydia says, I think co-sponsorship or sponsorship is needed to file a bill. Oh, Jihan said, I'd switch the first 2. Okay, so let's actually go back then. Hold on. All right, so I'm gonna start with what Lydia said. So, okay, Lydia is saying, would you need a co-sponsor before filing a bill? That's one question. And then Jihan, you're saying you'd switch the first, are you saying the first 2? So like you would switch bills filed and then session begins?
I was thinking more like switching the session to like somewhere after we filed the bills and then the committees are decided, like the session wouldn't be starting until like things are categorized.
Okay, all right, that's interesting. Okay, so Jihan is maybe saying like we switch, so bills are filed and then the session begins. And then Lydia is wondering if we want to move bill co-sponsorship before bills being filed. Do any folks have thoughts about either of those suggestions before we look at some of the other suggestions folks have made?
I feel like legislators have to sponsor a bill before it's filed. Just from seeing the research on the legislators, the first practice that we did, you could see that they were either were the author of a bill or co-sponsored something. So I feel like that comes much earlier than where we've put it on this chart.
Okay. Thanks, Nan. So Nan is saying co-sponsorship should go sooner. And as far as where co-sponsorship should go, we have Kali who says co-sponsorship should be moved to number 3. Any other folks kind of agree with any of the alternative ideas that have been put in the chat? I'm gonna test the waters a little bit and shift. So I didn't hear anyone say anything about these first two of the session begins and bill filed. I know that Jihan mentioned that. I haven't seen anyone else second that. Dora's saying though that she agrees with moving the co-sponsorship. So maybe let's look at that and let's think about where that could go. And I'm also looking at Vanessa's suggestion, who I think, Vanessa, your suggestion is to keep co-sponsorship where it is, but you're saying that you think session begins should be put later. And then so is Rachel. Okay, so I'm gonna test the waters here. I'm gonna move co-sponsorship and I'm gonna move it. Kali has suggested to number 3. So I'm gonna shift it there to just, and we can see and we can respond to this. All right, so Kali said maybe it goes number 3. And then we had, what was the other thing? Oh, the session begins. I think Rachel and Vanessa are saying that that maybe goes before voting happens. So would this mean here? Shifting. Is this what you all think is the right? Okay, Karen's saying that she likes that order. Nan is putting a thumbs up. Vanessa's saying yes. What do others think? Jihan's saying yes. All right. So for the sake of time, I'm gonna leave it here. And we're gonna talk about what the order is. So I am going to flip over, sorry, to another screen here. Lydia is saying that she believes session begins at the beginning, and we're gonna find out. So I'm gonna go over to the slides, and actually I'm gonna share now this Jamboard with you all so that you can check it out for yourselves now that we finished with the activity, and it won't be as confusing. Okay, so I'm gonna put this in the chat. So you all keep in mind what you had said, and I'm gonna share my screen with the process laid out on it. All right, so this is the right order of the session. So please note, every session begins in the odd numbered year. So we are in a new session right now. The session began January 2023. And as a reminder, the session is 2 years. So that is the first thing. The session begins, that is the first thing that happens. Nothing can sort of take place outside of session. And so that is the first step. The next step is that 5,000 to 7,000 bills are filed and co-sponsor requests are made. So right after a legislator files a bill, I'll use the RTA advancement bill as an example again. Once our legislators, our legislative leads, who are Rep. Blais and Senator Sue Moran, filed the bill, they then ask for co-sponsorships among their colleagues. And we as advocates asked for the same. You'll notice that there's a star next to this, and there's a star next to this step because this is a really critical place where advocates can get plugged into the legislative process. As I mentioned, we are the ones who initially approached Rep. Blais and Senator Moran about this bill, right? Rep. Blais is someone we've worked on this bill with for a couple of years now. Senator Sue Moran is a new co-sponsor because our former sponsor, she's a new sponsor because our former sponsor retired. But we were the ones to approach them. And it's not to say that every bill is created by advocates approaching their legislator. Some bills legislators and their staff care a lot about, and they take the lead on and they have the initial idea for. But there are also a lot of bills that advocates or people in community, they share an idea, they share a bill draft, or they share a need with their legislator, and they work with them to kind of put the policy together. So that's a huge place where advocates can get plugged in. And another place is co-sponsorship. So once the bill is filed, co-sponsorship shows how much support exists within the legislature for that bill. Co-sponsorship is not the end all be all. It's not to say if you have a lot of co-sponsors, your bill will definitely get passed, but it certainly helps to show, hey, many legislators care about this issue, right? Like this isn't just a passion project for the sponsors, but there's widespread support for this particular bill. And so that's the second step. And that's a huge place where advocates can get involved. So after our sponsors filed the RTA advancement bill, we as advocates then sent out a ton of emails and texts and phone calls to our partners to say, hey, can you get in touch with your legislator and ask them to co-sponsor this bill as a way of trying to build support for the bill and build awareness of the bill. The next step that we have, so that's January of 2023. The next thing that happens is between February and March, and that is bills are divided into committees and representatives and senators are actually assigned to committees. And the more that I think about, I think, Catherine, it was your question, the more I think it is leadership that decides not just the chairs, but who's on different committees, because I think this information all comes out at one time. But again, we'll still follow up with clarification on that. But that is sort of the next step. So now that we have the session that's begun, we know what our bills are. The bills are then sort of sorted among committees, and representatives and senators are actually assigned to said committees. All right. And Vanessa, I see your comment in the chat. I understood it as session begins for discussing and voting. No, the legislative session is the period of time in which legislators are looking at certain bills. And so we mentioned, if you remember, when we talked about the legislative structure earlier on, we talked about legislators meeting year round in 2-year sessions. Every 2 years, our legislators are up for re-election, and new candidates might throw their hat in the ring for their candidacy for a legislative position. And so, you know, we had at the end of last year, we had elections and we had a class of new legislators who were voted in. And then the new session began in January of 2023 and will end December 2024, where we will have, you know, elections again, and then a new class of legislators that'll come in and new bills that are filed. So that happens every 2 years, and those are called legislative sessions. So a session is 2 years. And then lastly, from March to December, which is a long time, right? So there's this long stretch in the process where we have a few things happen, and they happen, some bills are moved more quickly than others, but what essentially happens is that every bill that's filed before the bill filing deadline gets a hearing. So the hearings are held. And that's a space where legislators open it up to the public to hear from them what bills they support and what bills they don't support and why. So for example, we are waiting to hear when our hearing might be for the RTA advancement bill is, and we even might put in a request for when we want it to take place, and see if our legislators agree and if they can move that request forward. And then once the hearing is actually scheduled, we will organize folks like people who ride the bus, right? We'll organize people who work on issues like food security in certain communities. We'll organize transportation experts and advocates, and we'll have all of those people provide testimony and share why our bill should be passed. And so that happens next. After the committee hearings are held, some bills are going to be reported favorably out of committee. And being reported favorably out of committee is essentially a committee saying, we think this bill is a good enough idea and we support it potentially moving through in the legislative process. So that's when the bill is released from, let's say, the Joint Committee on Transportation, and it goes on to the next step in the legislative process. And so if you file a bill, the first big step after your hearing is wanting to see the committee vote favorably on your bill and report it favorably out of committee. After that, leadership moves along favorable bills. So again, everybody gets a vote, but it's only some people within positions of power that really help determine what actually gets to move. And if there's enough support built for the bill, particularly within leadership, a floor vote will then be held for the bill, where the House and Senate decide whether or not they want to pass it, and they reconcile any differences that might exist within those bills before it's moved on to the governor, who also has an option to veto the bill and to stop it in its tracks if they want to. But that is sort of how the process works. And the two key moments for advocacy that we want to call out here are the beginning of the process with the bill filing and co-sponsorships, and then the committee hearings, because again, any of you can register to provide testimony during a hearing. You could do it either orally, or you can provide and submit a written testimony. I see there's a question in the chat. Oh, never mind, Vanessa was just saying thank you. I want to pause there and see if there are any questions that folks have about this process. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of us here, I can't remember who it was, said that next Thursday, they're going to the State House about a bill to create overdose prevention centers.
Yes, that was me.
Oh, hi, Sierra.
Hi.
So I'm just curious then, does this mean that that bill is in hearing, and that's what Sierra and her advocates are going to do to be able to hear about public comment on that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I was wondering that same thing. Hold on one second. I'm sending, can you see that graphic I just sent?
In the chat? Yes. I'm trying to.
It doesn't really tell like the status of it, but it gives you the number for it looks like, I guess, 2 bills, and then it says who's sponsoring it. So I know there will be lobbying, and then at 2:30, I believe, I would assume maybe that was committee hearing.
Cool.
So I am trying to see, so Sierra, I for some reason I clicked to download, but I can't find where this photo has downloaded. Okay, hold on, it's in the picture app. I'm trying to look at it so I can tell you, but I don't currently have the flyer up. So I can't tell specifically if that's the case for yours. If there's a committee hearing, then yes, the bill is at the hearing process, which makes a lot of sense because there are a lot of bills that are being heard right now. One of our bill that we are supporting, that environmental justice advocates have really been pushing for around the siting of different types of energy facilities, that is having a hearing next Tuesday. I think Tuesday's the 20th. That's having a hearing on Tuesday the 20th. So I know that our staff will be going, advocates from environmental justice groups will be coming into the State House or clicking in online to testify during the hearing. And so there are hearings that are taking place next week. To your question though, Karen,
I actually just looked it up. Sorry to interrupt.
No, you're
I
fine.
looked it up and at least the H1981 is in committee. It was introduced back in February. And so it just says Senate concurred on 216. So it's in committee right now. And so I'm assuming they're going to be discussing that on Thursday, the 22nd.
Yeah, and I mean, the way I'll just, let me stop sharing now and I'm gonna go to, we can tell you right now, there's a way to find hearings on the website, and I'm just gonna go online. I'm gonna pull this up for you all so you can see it. To find out when hearings are taking place. So I'm on the Mass Legislature website, which you all had gone on to earlier to find your legislators and to do some sleuthing. If you go to the hearings tab, you can click on the hearings tab and you can find joint committee hearings and click on that. And then that will take you to this page that's down here and you can actually see the schedule. So we can scroll down and see, you're talking about next Thursday, you said, Ciara?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
The 22nd.
So next Thursday is the 22nd. So if you don't see it here, that likely means that it's not a hearing. And so if it's not a hearing, that could mean that it's a number of things. Advocates do things like lobby days. You don't need the legislature to tell you that it's time to do a lobby day, right? And this kind of gets into something we'll talk about later, which is thinking about the right method, right? We're talking about the right time. And when we talk about the right time, we're talking about this in a more of a high level way, because some of you are in a place where you just want to learn more about the process. And what the best next step for you to do is going to be to find an organization like MPHA, like other orgs that do advocacy, that work on issues you care about, and to plug in with them. And they can tell you, listen, this is the time that we want to do X, Y, Z, right? The timelines that I'm sharing with you that you can plug into are things that you can do on your own as a constituent. If you're leading a campaign, that's something different, because when you're leading a campaign, there are certain milestones and markers that the legislature has in place that kind of go along with the rhythms of the legislature. But as I mentioned earlier, when we were looking at that slide, let me go back to it, hold on. When we were looking at this slide about the bill timing, you can see this last step here, March 2023 to December 2024. That's a long time, right? Which means there can be a really big lull in between when the legislature is actually doing anything on your bill, which means if you're leading a campaign, you're going to want to have to create your own momentum. So things like lobby days, for example, are a great way to build your momentum, because it's getting people who care about the issue like Ciara and other folks that might be interested in that bill to come to the State House and to talk to legislators about why it's important, so that it doesn't disappear from their radar, if that makes sense. So we're talking about sort of two key times for people to know about to plug in, but all along the way, we mentioned legislators are in session for 2 years year round, and there are opportunities to sort of interact with them throughout the years. We're just talking about, as people who are coming onto this training, what are kind of like two key moments that you should be aware of where you should be plugging into the process, and other ways to sort of influence the process you can learn about from orgs that perhaps lead campaigns. Or if you're interested in leading a campaign and you want to talk more about strategy and timing, we are absolutely happy to talk about that and to be a sounding board. Okay, I know there was another question, and I think it's from Kathleen. Okay. Yes, Kathleen, you know what? That's a question. I'm going to follow up with you on that question if that sounds good. Okay. All right. Are there any other questions about this process or anything we say that doesn't make sense?
I have one question that's not entirely related, but sort of. When a vote goes to the floor, is that something you can go watch if it's something you're really excited about?
That's a really good question, and I do believe so. When floor votes are held, I think that it's typically made public or it's known, what is being heard on any particular day, and that's something that you can sort of tune into to hear, how it's going. I will say they're often not super exciting in that party leadership will make sure that they sort of whip up votes so they know how it's going to go, and so it's really just kind of like a pro forma kind of thing, which isn't as exciting, but yes, that is often something that you can tune into, especially now that we have virtual meetings and so much is done virtually. It makes it so much easier for folks to be able to tune in with these types of things. All right. Okay, so we're going to move on. And I just want to make a quick note before we talk about legislator engagement. I just want to make a note about the state budget. So we talked about the bill process, right? How a bill moves through to become a law. And we know that happens within a session, which can anyone just put in the chat or like say out loud, how long is a session again? A legislative session. Karen's holding up 2. Yes. 2 years. 2 years is a session, right? So that process could take 2 years for the bill to actually be passed. But there's another process that I want you all to be aware of that happens. And this happens not every 2 years, but every year. And it's one of the biggest bills to pass each year within the legislature. And that is the state budget, which decides how state revenue is going to be spent. Some of you may be familiar with the state budget because we are in the state budget process right now. And I just want to share, it very much so mirrors in some ways how the legislative process unfolds for a bill becoming a law, like other bills becoming a law, except it's within a much shorter time frame. So Mass Budget and Policy Center puts out this really great infographic that I just want to share with you all and talk through really quickly. So typically, and this year was a little bit different because we have a new governor. So the new governor gets a little bit more time to put their budget together. But typically, so when we think about next year, the governor will propose her budget in January. And even before that, in December, the governor and legislators will kind of agree on how much money they think is estimated that the state is going to bring in revenue in the coming year. The governor then proposes a budget in January. In April, the House Ways and Means Committee, which we talked about committees, this committee proposes what their budget is, and then other House members have an opportunity to suggest amendments or changes to the budget. And, as that process happens, similar to a bill, if a legislator files a budget amendment, other legislators can co-sponsor or express support for it. And then the House has meetings and comes together and votes to decide which amendments actually get adopted into the budget and what doesn't. So then the House kind of has their budget. So we've already been through that in Massachusetts. Then the same thing happens in the Senate. So Senate Ways and Means proposes their budget. Legislators are free to file amendments to that budget. Co-sponsorships are made for those amendments, and then it's decided what's going to be adopted into the Senate budget and what won't. We then move into conference committee. And as we're in conference committee, that is where the House and Senate resolve their differences between the two budgets. And that's actually where we are right now. So in June, we have conferees who are people from leadership, from House and Senate leadership, who come together. And it's usually the Senate Ways and Means chairs and vice chairs of the House and Senate, and then the minority leader for minority leaders within the House and Senate. And so that group of people come together to resolve differences between the House and Senate budget. And then after that, the governor has the ability to veto any items in the budget. The legislature has an opportunity to override any vetoes and say, nope, governor, we don't agree with you here. And then a final budget is passed. And ideally that happens by July 1st every year, but typically that's not done until later in July, where that final budget is passed. But that is sort of the process for the state budget. And just like in the process of a bill becoming a law, there are opportunities like key moments for advocates to plug in. The same goes for the state budget. And so there are opportunities within the House to try to get legislators to file amendments to the budget, and the same goes in the Senate. And there are also opportunities to try to encourage the conference committee to support certain provisions from either the House or the Senate budget in the final budget. So I just wanted to do like a quick overview of that. Are there any questions people have from that process before we turn to legislator engagement and do a little bit of role playing? How does that process impact bills? Lovely, that's a really good question. And it really kind of depends. Before, actually, when we were on break, Kali and I were having a conversation, and she had mentioned a bill that her organization supports and our organization supports as well, around universal school, like free universal meals for kids in schools in Massachusetts, and making that like a permanent thing in Massachusetts. There is, I think, and Kali, correct me if I'm wrong, but there in the House budget, the final House budget actually has language that would make permanent that program within schools in Massachusetts. So to make school meals free for all kids in Massachusetts, it would kind of codify that into law. So that's in the House budget. And there's also, though, a bill that was filed to do that. And so if the House and Senate both agree that it should be in the final budget, that might mean that like the bill that was filed, at least one provision of the bill, it's already passed. It's just passed through a different policy vehicle. And so I would say that the way that the budget process impacts the bill process is really, I would think about it in two ways. One is that within the budget bill, you can not just propose money like funding levels, but you can also propose policy language. And if the policy language is passed, then that policy language might align with the bill that you filed. And that might be that like, you don't even have to work on that bill anymore because you were able to get the policy language in through the budget. So like, that's one way that it can impact it. I would say another way too, is that it can kind of help build momentum or set the stage for a bill getting passed. So going back to the example of the RTA advancement bill, one of the provisions of the bill is that we want to set a minimum floor for operating funds for regional transit authorities of $150 million. We want that to be the floor. Currently in state law, I think it's something like 15 million, which they get more than that, but like 15 million is kind of like the floor that's actually in state law. So we're trying to get that bumped to 150 million, which is a huge increase over what RTAs receive currently, which is closer to 94 million across 15 different agencies. And so within the budget, we were able to advocate and get the Senate to put in their budget $150 million for operating for those agencies, which aligns with our ask, which is great. If the Senate and the House can agree to keep that in like the final budget, that means that our bill is going to have a much better chance of passing, because that provision around 150 million, we've kind of like gotten over the hurdle for that a little bit, right? And so it may increase the likelihood that the bill will get passed because the legislature has at least already done part of it, right? And so I think that those are kind of the two ways that it can impact. Like sometimes you can get bill language, policy language passed through the budget, and sometimes the budget can just help set the stage for what you want to do through one of your bills, if that makes sense. So I would say that those are some of the ways in which the two processes influence one another. All right. So I feel, and Kate, I don't know how you feel about this. I feel like we just talked about a lot, and I'm wondering if we should take like, maybe just like a minute-long stretch here. We can just do a minute-long stretch before we dive into engagement. And so I'm sitting, but feel free to sit, stand, and just kind of stretch out your neck a little bit. blink your eyes because you've been looking at a screen for a really long time, stretch your arms, just do what you need to do to kind of get comfortable and get settled in, because we're next going to talk about how to engage legislators. So we've talked about the who, right? We've talked about who the legislature is comprised of, how power is held. We've talked about the when, and kind of what are key opportunities to influence legislators in the legislative process. And now we want to talk about how do you effectively engage legislators in your advocacy? And so why don't we go ahead and get started on this? And I think that there's one question that we want to ask, and it's kind of a trick question, but we'll see what people say. When is the best time to engage your legislators? Sierra says all the time. What about others? What do others think? When is the best time to engage your legislators? As soon as the need or cause arises, January for budget is a good time. Yeah, so there are different answers, and really the right answer is all of the above, right? As Sierra says, we have opportunity to engage our legislators year round for the 2-year sessions. So we should really always be building a relationship. I don't know about you, but I'm much more likely to want to do something for someone who I know, right? If Lovely is coming to me regularly to talk to me about, I don't know, I'm just going to post, I don't know what issue work on Lovely, so I'm just going to kind of ad lib a little bit. But if Lovely is always coming to me to talk about youth mental health, and perhaps like a particular issue within youth mental health, and she's sharing that, like, you know what, the curricula for youth mental health in schools is like abysmal, and we need to do a better job of like codifying that into law and making sure that schools have the resources needed to implement those programs. If Lovely's coming to me to talk to me about that, like quite often, right? Or I know Lovely, I know the type of work that Lovely does. When the time comes to actually co-sponsor a bill, or when the time comes to fight hard for a budget amendment, I'm so much more likely to want to do what Lovely wants me to do because we have a relationship that's been established, right? So all the time is absolutely right, and continuously is right. But also we know, just as Nan and as Kali says, sometimes there are key moments where we want to be engaging around specific parts of the process. And so maybe if the budget is something we want to influence, we want to get to people early, and we want to be talking to our legislators, or we want to be talking to the governor in January. Or perhaps, you know, if in my community, I'm noticing that, you know, we're having a lot of accidents, like we're having a lot of bike accidents because the bike lanes are not robust enough in the community, and we need funds for our Complete Streets projects. Like, I'm going to be talking to my legislator when that comes up, because that's the thing that we need to be thinking about. And I need to put my head together with them to think about how can we make this happen, right? So it's really all of the above, but please just be encouraged that you can continuously be engaging with your legislators and building relationships. And so I just want to share a few tips and tricks that we have compiled before Kate kind of dives into a framework for thinking about engaging with legislators. And so we just want to talk about making the most of your superpower. So these are just a couple of things. One is that you have more power if you're registered to vote and if you voted in recent elections. Some of you may know this, but legislators and their staff can actually access and see who is registered to vote and whether you voted in a recent election. They can't see how you voted. That information is absolutely private, but they can see if you are voting. And they're going to be more likely to want to listen to folks who are more actively voting, because those are the people who can put them into office. And so that's just something to be aware of, and a plug for folks to be registered to vote. Another tip is that stories are stickier than data. And so I know many of us who work in our fields, we might have really compelling data. You know, for the RTA advancement bill issue, for example, we talk about the fact that 55% of people in the state of Massachusetts live in a regional transit authority service area, and yet less than 7% of state transit operations funds go to support RTAs. The rest go to the MBTA, right? Which is like a pretty shocking data point for many legislators to hear. But what's going to be even more sticky for them is hearing a writer from their district come in to talk about the fact that they can't go to their classes at a community college because service ends at 7:30 p.m. and they have classes that go until 9 p.m. right? And so stories are going to be stickier than data. So we don't want to forego the data, but we want to make sure that we're really bringing in those personal stories of either you have experienced or that folks that you work with have experienced related to the issue. We want to keep our discussion of the issue concise because your interactions with legislators are going to be relatively brief and you want to make the most of the time that you have. We also want to make sure, and I know someone flagged this earlier, staff are important. We don't want to ignore the staff. I think Kate talked about this. You know, staff are the ones who help do policy research, bring issues before legislators. They're in charge of their calendars, right? So if you have a good relationship with a staff person, you're going to be that much more likely to get to the legislator or have like one of their earpieces, right, that you're able to talk to. So don't ignore them. Staff are really valuable. And sometimes meeting with staff is even more helpful than meeting with the legislator because they're going to get into the nitty-gritty about the policy with you, whereas the legislator may not have the time or the space to do so. And then lastly, always make sure to follow up with a thank you when you do engage with legislators. Legislators say all the time that they're not thanked enough. And so, you know, it's helpful in building a relationship to follow up with those thank yous and to let them know that what they've done has perhaps made a difference. Yeah, and Kate, I'll pass it to you.
Great. Thank you, Alexis. So we learned about our superpowers, and now we are going to learn about our 3 secret ingredients to advocacy. These are our putting solutions over problems, making a clear ask, and as Alexis just nodded to earlier, combining stories and data to really make an effective stance for your issue. So the bottom line, again, is that legislators are our decision makers. Step 1 is sort of bringing the issue to them, letting them know that there's a problem in our community that needs to be addressed. But then the second step of that process is letting them know what the solution is and what you need them to do, what you want them to do. So it is important to make that clear ask, to support a certain bill, or to vote yes or no on an issue. And to also anchor that ask with the combination of powerful stories and data. Again, data is important because it is useful in explaining the reach or the severity. As Alexis just mentioned, those really pertinent data points related to the RTA advancement bill. But we want to touch the head and the heart. And so that's where our stories come in. We have heard directly from legislators that humanizing an issue is really important to them. So you shouldn't be afraid to make it personal, especially if you are somebody or if you know somebody that has a lived experience with the problem that you are discussing. I have an example too. Alexis, you beat me to it with the RTA advancement bill. But 40% of regional transit authorities cannot offer service 7 days a week due to funding restrictions. And I would follow that up with a conversation, if I was in a conversation with my legislator, that I have somebody in my community who struggles to get their groceries after service hours. This person relies on a wheelchair and uses the RTA to get around our town and has difficulty even meeting a basic need due to the lack of availability in our transit system locally. Alexis, will you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. All right, so we are going to do a bit of a fun activity. We are going to have you all do a role play. And before I get into that, I'm going to drop a link in the chat. And this link will bring you to a list of bills that we have compiled that we think you may take an interest in. So we are going to have you all pair up and go into breakout rooms and do a role play where one of you will be the legislator and the other will be a constituent. So if you are in the role of the constituent and you can decide amongst yourselves, you are going to use those superpowers and the secret ingredients that we outlined for you in the previous slides. And you are going to try to influence your legislator on behalf of one of these bills that you will choose. And if you are the legislator, please feel free to ask clarifying questions, engage your constituent around the issue, and make this feel as real as possible. And thank you, Tanayo, for putting those questions right in the chat for folks to see.
Kate, should we do like a quick, how do you think we should handle folks getting time to kind of like take a look at that sheet with the information around the bills?
Should we take a minute here before going into breakout rooms, or do you want to just build in extra time?
Maybe we should just kind of like give a quick overview of like the different types of bills, like maybe like the what for each of the three, if that's all, if you think that'd be good. Okay.
Yes. So if everyone has that document open in front of them, I'll give one more minute just to get that together. Oh, thank you, Alexis, for screen sharing. That makes things easier. The first bill that we have listed here, and Alexis, you may want to zoom in. I'm thinking that the text may be small.
Yep.
But the first bill that we have listed here is SAFE 2.0. So this is one of MPHA's priority bills that has to do with local public health infrastructure. And what this does in the first bullet point is it creates minimum public health standards across communities. Right now, we have a lot of disparity in that way. It increases capacity and effectiveness because it incentivizes different municipalities to share their services and their resources across districts. And it also creates a uniform data collection and reporting service among the municipalities. The second bill that we have listed here is related to agriculture and the healthy incentives program here in Mass, also known as HIP, where there's a program currently where people are able to use their SNAP benefits to buy fresh produce directly from farmers or at farm stands. However, this has only been authorized through the state budget currently. And so this bill would create a permanent program to make sure that this is able to stay sustainable so that people continue to have access to healthy and fresh produce. And then this third bill at the bottom is related to mental health education. So currently in the state, there is no mandate to include mental health education in schools K through 12, public and private. And so this would integrate mental health education into our physical education programs and make sure that that is included in curriculum too. Thank you, Alexa.
No, thank you for just kind of giving that overview. So why don't folks, oops, I realized I did something to my chat here that I didn't mean to do. But so why don't folks take just a little bit of time and just take a look at those three bills on that sheet that we put into the chat. And once you've kind of taken a look, pick one that you would want to talk about as a constituent. It doesn't have to be perfect. Some of these issues are issues that some of you might work on. Others are issues that you just might realize like, yeah, I think that's important. And just pick what you'd want to role play. And I think when we break up into pairs, I think there can be flexibility. So ideally, both of you would have an opportunity to be the constituent and legislator. So if you can kind of switch off and we can message you when we're about halfway through for time, we should do that. But let's say you're in a room and there's one person who has never done this before, never talked to a legislator before, and there's another person who is like an old pro, right, at this. Then you all can decide, you know what, like, why don't we give more time to the person who's never done it before, and we can kind of like practice, and you can give tips and feedback, etc. So yes, I think so. We have our link, and maybe we could just put that in the chat one more time. I've zoomed in from my chat, which is very inconvenient. So I'm trying to reset it so I can see better. But yeah, why don't we get the link again for this document into the chat so you all can see it. So you should be able to see that again. And then HRIA team, whenever you're ready to break folks off into small groups. I guess actually really quick, does anyone have any questions about what we're going to do? Or does anybody kind of have any confusion about the instructions?
Alexis, how many minutes did you say we'll be in the breakout?
You know what? I don't think I did. So thank you for asking that question, Karen. Kate, what did we decide on for this again? Do you remember?
I'm checking. I want to say we were allowing 20 minutes. However, I'm not sure if that was I think that's for the whole section. I don't know if we discussed the amount of time for the activity itself.
Maybe we say 8 minutes for now, because there are 2 of you. Maybe we say 8 minutes for now, and we can pop into the rooms and see how people are doing. And if people want more time, we can add more time. Why don't we say 8 minutes for now? And I'm just going to put the questions, our guiding questions again in the chat that Kate went over, that you want to think through if you're the constituent. All right, HRIA team, I think we are ready for our breakouts. All right, Kate, do you want to pick up with sharing your screen?
Sure. I apologize. I was popping around to different breakout rooms. I think there was 1 or 2 I didn't have time to get to, but I hope all of your role plays went well. And actually, Alexis, before I start screen sharing, maybe we should take a minute to just ask folks how it went and if there was anything that was interesting or exciting or was notable that came out of the activity. Feel free to either pop it in the chat, and hopefully we can get 1 or 2 volunteers who may be brave and come off of mute as well.
I'll start. We had our conversation went around a couple of issues, and then Sierra brought up lobbying, which led to a little tangent of maybe a whole nother training should be done on lobbying, but that just trying to understand better how lobbying affects this process we've been talking about today, because my general understanding is that lobbying's a pretty heavy hitter and an influencer in how some of these things take place. And yes, the slides, I was going to ask that later, if some of these slides would be available after.
Yes. Thank you, Alexis, for acknowledging that in the chat. And there were a couple other breakout rooms that I came into too, where lobbying was a topic of discussion. So we will get to that later in the training, and agree, probably could have its own separate training, but we will do our best to cover as much as we can within the time that we have, given that, you know, lobbying has certain implications, and depending on where you work, you may have some restrictions in that way. But glad to hear that there was some good conversation that came out of this activity. Was there anybody else who would like to contribute?
I can jump in. I was paired up with Stormy and Rachel. Rachel's new to lobbying or to advocacy, so she wanted to watch the 2 of us do the role play. And Stormy did a really great job of selling me on the mental health bill. She did a great job of doing a lot of stats around the local level and how it affected the constituents within her community, which I know from my experience is what legislators often want to hear, is very specifically locally how it's going to impact their constituents. So it was great.
Absolutely. Yes, I think something that we talk about sometimes too, Alexis, is that there's nothing stopping you from talking to any legislator, but they do like to hear most from the constituents that are their own. And so you really have the most influence with your own legislators that way. So awesome. Thank you for sharing, Kelly. All right, great. So I think we are ready to get into our next slide, and I am going to take over the screen share for just a moment. So bear with me for 1 second here. Okay, could I get a thumbs up that you all can see this slide? Awesome. Okay, so we,
Kate, if you just, well, actually, maybe it doesn't matter for this because you're gonna be going on the website. I was gonna say you could make the slide a little bit, like the main slide a little bit bigger, but I think it's okay either way, because you're gonna be toggling back and forth.
did
Yeah.
that change it at all?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So we are going to be returning to our dear friend, the MA Legislature website. And I know that we've explored it through the angle of starting with our legislators and learning more about who they are and who, you know, some of the bills that they may have sponsored or co-sponsored in the past. Now we are going to get into it from the angle of looking at which legislation is currently active. And I'm going to drop the link in the chat for you all one more time. Actually, Alexis, oh wait, never mind, I found it. I couldn't find my chat box for a second.
I dropped it in the chat to Kate.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Okay, great. So I went ahead and went to the website for you all, and I'm going to use the example of one of the bills that we used earlier from the Google Doc, which is SAFE 2.0. So SAFE's bill number, the House bill number is H2204. And if you put it here in the search bar, you can see where the bill is located on the website. And it will usually show you in this corner to the accompanying Senate bill number. And so once you have this pulled up, you can look at the presenters who are listed here. So we have Hannah Kane and we have Denise Garlick, who sponsored this bill. And if you go down to this little tab here where it says petitioners, you can also see the names of the co-sponsors. So on some bills, this list is very long. As you can see, SAFE has a whole lot of co-sponsors, which is something that we are pretty proud of at MPHA. In some bills, this list will be smaller, but that is where you can find those. And you can also look to see which committee it is in. So SAFE was referred to the Committee on Public Health back in February. And that way you can see what committee that bill is located in too. We had thought about doing this as more of an interactive activity, but for the sake of time, I just wanted to give you all that little overview. But you can, feel free to explore the website further on your own time as well and find out more information about the bills that you care about in that method.
Can I just add one other thing, Kate? When you were doing this, so Kate kind of took this from, if you have the bill number, if you know what bill you're interested in, you want to learn more about that act of legislation, you can also search by doing a whole host of things. So earlier we kind of talked about going through your legislator, so finding your legislator and learning what bills they've sponsored, right? So there are different ways that you can find what bills are filed. But one of the things we also just want to leave you all with, and we'll share this with the HRA team to put in the follow-up, is this is just kind of like a quick, we ended up uploading it to Google Docs, but it's essentially a document that kind of walks you through how to navigate the website and how to track how to track legislation if that's something you're interested in. So it kind of just like has step-by-step how to go about doing that. So if you all are interested and if that's helpful, you can feel free to use that in your own time.
Alexis, are you going to resume screen sharing, or I can continue?
It's totally up to you. Do you want me to?
I think that would be helpful.
Okay, awesome. I will do that. Just give me a moment. Making this a little bit bigger. Okay, great. Here you go.
Thank you. Okay, so we are going to get into now using the right method when it comes to advocacy. And although we talked about earlier how we are very lucky in Massachusetts and we can contact our legislators and meet with our legislators at any time, it is important to consider things like where you are in the legislative session and what method will yield the right amount of pressure in your given situation for the bill that you are advocating for. So here we have a list of the many different methods that you can use in your advocacy. And an example that I can give as well is back in April, our organization held a lobby day, which gave an opportunity for a large number of people to come and meet with legislators and lobby for two of our priorities, one which is SAFE and the other the RTA advancement bill. And because it was early in the session, this was sort of like a friendly way to get face-to-face with a lot of different legislators to communicate about what matters to us, which at that point was the appropriate amount of pressure without coming off too strong at that time. However, if you, for example, were getting towards the end of the legislative session and you still aren't seeing progress on the particular bill that you care about, it might be more appropriate to choose a method like a rally or write an op-ed because it just yields a higher amount of pressure. The bottom line here is that the right method is not a one-size-fits-all type of deal. And it's definitely important to think strategically about what and when and how you want to communicate on behalf of your bill. Next, we'll get into the right messenger. And so this is another thing that is really important to consider. And what we mean by this is it's important to get to know your decision makers, like we did through the activity earlier when you were on the Mass Legislature website. Who they are, what matters to them, those are all important things to know and can be really helpful when you are tailoring your ask. And things that you might want to pay attention to are what type of work they were involved in before coming into office. I think, Alexis, you said that your legislator was involved in like hospitality, right? So that's an important thing to know. It can really inform your strategy in regard to who should be communicating with them as well. So an example that I can provide here is that if an issue you're working on is reducing maternal mortality rates, for example, and you have a legislator who really values community voice, you may push to have families impacted by that issue reach out directly by email or by phone, or have them share their testimonies during a hearing for a related bill. But on the other hand, you may have a legislator who previously worked in the medical field themselves, and you may feel a different approach would be useful. You might have professionals like obstetricians who have witnessed maternal mortality in a professional capacity in their fields reach out and advocate why they want to see that needed change. So it's all about thinking strategically about who is best to deliver a message in this case. Great. Thank you, Alexis. One of the things that we like to point out here is that when it comes to advocacy, you really don't have to work alone. And if all of this information still seems a little intimidating or overwhelming, the good news is that there is power in numbers, and there are sometimes a surprising number of organizations that exist and are already advocating around the issues that you care about. Sometimes all it takes is a simple Google search, an email, a phone call to find that community and get you started. And the real point is, no matter how niche an issue is that you're passionate about, there are likely already folks out there doing that type of work. So we've listed a couple of different coalitions and organizations here. Our own, the SAFE 2.0 coalition. We have the Feed Kids Coalition that is led by Project Bread. And we also have MAMH, which is a mental health organization located right here in Boston. And since so many were interested earlier, I'll pass it off to Alexa so we can get into lobbying.
Yes, so we are going to do a quick note on lobbying. Before doing that, though, just to kind of like close everything that that Kate just shared and all the other things that we shared. I just want to reiterate again, we talked about this framework, right? The right information, which you all identified some of that right information when you were doing your role playing activity with the different bills that you were hoping to promote. So you want to get the right information. So that could be a bill. It could be just information on a recent report. Right, that like was released around, the example that Kate shared, maternal mortality rates, right? But you want to get the right information that you think is going to make a difference in giving you what you want. You want to bring it to the right people. And we've talked about the legislature. We've talked about who's in the legislature, how powers help within the legislature. We want to make sure we're bringing it to them at the right time. And so we know that that is year round during 2-year sessions, which we're really fortunate to be able to do in Massachusetts. And there are sometimes very strategic points within the legislative session where it especially makes a difference for us to be active as advocates. We want to make sure that we're using the right format. And so Kate shared some considerations when thinking about format. And then we also want to make sure it's coming from a messenger that's going to really influence our decision makers who have the power to give us what we want. And so we talked about that framework. And as Kate said, if you all would like to get in touch with us at the Mass Public Health Association to sort of learn more, like let's say there's an issue that you really care about, but you're like, I have no idea where to even start to find a group that's working on this. Kate mentioned, you can do Google searches. And so that can get you very far. But if you're wanting to talk to anybody, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll have our contact information at the end of the presentation, and the slides will be shared with you all to keep as well. So just know that, as Kate said, there's power in numbers, and all of that analysis of sort of like, what is the right method, and what's the right time, all those different types of things. There are organizations that have full-time lobbyists, like at the Mass Public Health Association, who do a lot of that analysis and who can provide some of that information for you to get you started. But as Kate said, because lobbying is something that many people wanted to know more about, we did want to take some time to review that. And so I'll just want to flag, I know that we got started a little bit later. And so I think, and HRIA crew, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the plan is that we will be on the call until 12:45. We're going to try to wrap by 12:30 with like the lobbying piece. But if folks have additional questions that you want to ask that you weren't able to ask during the presentation, we can take some time. So Kate and I can be on from at least 12:30 to 12:45 to take questions that folks might have. So let's dive in to these slides about lobbying. So why advocate and lobby? It's because, and we've talked about this already, right? Officials need your eyes and ears. It's critical. You have expertise, you have knowledge about community. There's just a whole host of information and relationships that you bring to the table that our elected officials do not have. And so advocacy and lobbying is not just something we should do, it's something we must do if we want to see changes in our communities and if we want to see healthier communities. Lobbying and advocacy impacts who gets what, when, and how. The example we gave around the RTA, the advocacy for RTA communities, right? That advocacy is leading to perhaps an increase in funding for agencies that provide services. Like that advocacy can impact who gets the resources, right? Like the Fair Share Amendment someone mentioned earlier was passed. And so there's a whole new source of revenue for transportation and education. And it's advocacy that kind of helps to shape where that money actually goes, right? So it impacts who gets what, when, and how. It creates dialogue, and it also has positive impacts on public health. So we know that both are important. But what's the difference, right? What is lobbying? What is advocacy? So advocacy is sort of like catch-all phrase that we use to talk about you trying to influence like the outcome of a process, or you trying to raise awareness about an issue, right? So all lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. Advocacy is sort of the catch-all term, but when we think about lobbying, lobbying is expressing an opinion about a specific piece of, in this case, legislation, and asking a legislator or asking a person to take action in support of or against that piece of policy. And so direct lobbying involves three things. It involves communication to an elected official or their staff, a specific piece of legislation, and an opinion on that legislation. And typically like an ask, right, in the direction of that legislation. And then grassroots lobbying is communication to people. So we mentioned that we facilitate a couple of coalitions. When we communicate with our coalition members, that is that communication. We're expressing a view on a specific piece of legislation, and we have a call to action, right? That is lobbying. So lobbying is typically very specific to a piece of policy, and you're expressing a position on that policy and asking for a person in office to take action on that policy. So that is lobbying. So why don't we take a look here? There are a few kind of like scenarios that we have, and I'm not going to have us go through all of them. I'm just going to have us maybe look at two, and we're going to see whether we think it's advocacy or lobbying. And so let's see, how about we start, let's start with this first one. So let's say you are sending a mass email to a listserv and you're asking subscribers to contact their legislator about co-sponsoring a bill that protects low-income people from being evicted. Is that, and you can put this in the chat, from what we've said, what advocacy and lobbying is this general advocacy, or is this lobbying? Is this specifically lobbying? Interesting. Okay. So a lot of folks are saying advocacy, and in that you are correct. It is advocacy, but it is also lobbying. This is an example of advocacy, because all lobbying is advocacy, but not all advocacy is lobbying. So it is advocacy, but more specifically, it is lobbying. And Lovely has shared this in the chat. Lovely, would you mind taking yourself off of mute and sharing why you think this is the case?
Sorry, it just took me a minute to find
No
the
worries.
mute button. Yes, I believe because it is asking them to support a particular bill.
Yes, and that is correct. This is an example of, this is not just advocacy, this is lobbying. And the reason this is lobbying is exactly as Lovely said, it's direct lobbying because this is grassroots lobbying, because you are asking people, you are communicating with a group of people and asking them to put out an ask to a decision maker about a specific piece of policy. So that's lobbying. Let's though look at the next example. So what if you organize an educational public forum for local politicians to debate and share their views on transportation issues? Do you all see this as general advocacy, or is this lobbying? Okay, so we have advocacy, general advocacy, and you all are right about that. And the reason you all are right about this is because this does not necessarily involve you bringing a specific bill to those legislators and asking them to take action on it or expressing a specific opinion on that piece of policy, right? It's general, it's open. There might be policies that are discussed, but you aren't necessarily taking a position or asking them to take specific action. So this is kind of awareness raising, general advocacy. And then maybe we look at one more. Actually, let's just look at the other two because I think they're helpful. What about this next one of speaking? You speak with the legislator about how a farmers market incentives program has impacted the community. Is that advocacy or lobbying? All right, we're seeing advocacy, advocacy, advocacy. And yes, you all are correct. Again, this is awareness is raising. This is, educating a legislator on a program and how it's impacted the community. That is advocacy, but it is not lobbying because it does not involve a specific policy, expressing an opinion on that policy and asking a legislator to take action or asking them to support one way or another. And what about the last one? You call or write members of the legislature and ask them to vote against the current version of a climate bill. All right, we got lobbying, great. Okay, and you all are correct, that is lobbying. So just think that's important just for folks to understand. I think lobbying can kind of get a bad rep, and it's because can be confusion around who can do it and when. But at the one thing I will say is that we can all advocate and lobby, but just want you all to be clear on what general advocacy is and what we mean when we talk about lobbying. So now that we know that, I think the important question to ask here then is when and how can you lobby? And the reason we ask this question is, as opposed to can I lobby, is because we believe that everybody can lobby. The question is when is it appropriate for you to lobby? We all have a responsibility to lobby. We talked about earlier, there are a ton of bills that are filed every single session. And without people talking to legislators or mobilizing other people to talk to their legislators about some of the policies that can make a difference in your community, legislators may not hear about it. Do not assume that other people are talking to your legislator or legislators about issues or bills or policy that's important to you. Don't assume, because they may not. It might be something that's overlooked until you or folks in your community sort of take that action. So we all have a responsibility to lobby. The questions really then become, there are a couple of questions. One is, how is your work funded? If your work is 100% state or federally funded, you can lobby on your own personal time, but you should not lobby in your professional capacity. And that is because there are laws around this. And so that is if your position is 100% state or federally funded. So if you know that that's the case, when can you lobby? You can lobby on your own personal time, right? If you want to write a written testimony in support of that bill around the Healthy Incentives Program, perhaps instead of saying your name and what organization you work with, you might say your name and the fact that you are a public health practitioner, or your name and you are a nurse, or your name and you are a teacher at a local school, right? You just don't want to bring your specific role and organization into it. You'll be general about your expertise, but you'll do that. You'll be general. You won't name your specific organization and position. And you also will do that maybe not using your work email or your work phone, but you would do it perhaps during your lunchtime or after you get off of work or on your day off, right? So if your work is 100% state or federally funded, you can lobby on your own personal time. So that's when you can lobby. If you work for an organization and your position is not 100% state or federally funded, but you're not sure, really and truly, oftentimes, so there are laws around how much lobbying someone can do before they actually have to be registered as a lobbyist. Most of you, unless your role is specifically as a lobbyist within your organization, most of you will not hit that threshold. And the threshold, I think, is 25 hours for 6 months out of the year, which is like 50 hours for a year. Most of you will never hit that. And so the question then becomes, if you're not going to hit that and your position isn't 100% state or federally funded, the question then becomes, what's your organization's policy around lobbying? And some of your specific organizations may have policies that say you can't, or they might have rules around what that looks like. And so check around the funding for your position. Once you know that, really the important thing, unless you are somebody who's doing lobbying full time, that's what you want to do full time, the next question is then, what's your organization's policy? Because they can give you a lot of guidance on that. And if your organization's policy is that you cannot lobby in your professional capacity, then again, just like the piece around 100% state or federally funded positions, you would then turn to lobbying on your own personal time. If your organization does not have strict rules around lobbying and allows you to lobby, especially if you're lobbying on behalf of policies that can advance the organization's goals, then you're good to go in your professional capacity. And so it's really the question is when can you lobby? And in some cases, it's going to be on your own personal time. And in other cases, many cases, more probably than you would imagine, you can lobby both in your personal time and then also in your professional capacity. And so that is what we wanted to share, just a little bit about lobbying. I will note I am not I'm not a lawyer. And also you all have not hired me for legal advice. So these are kind of general guidelines that I'm providing, but I cannot provide you legal advice. So that's not what this is, but these are kind of some general guidelines that might be helpful for you in thinking about what lobbying looks like for you in your role at your organization. Okay, lovely. You ask a really great question. What if your position is partially funded by the state, but mainly funded by local government? I would say in that case, you should talk to your organization because they're going to know sort of like maybe what pots of money are used to fund. But I will say, like, there are people that we know in local government who lobby. And so really, I think it's more going to be like, I think you can legally lobby if you're funded at the local level by your local government. And it's probably just a matter of organizational policy. So in that case, I would say talk to your organization. And most local governments have a lawyer that is on staff who can also answer some of those questions. But the restrictions where it's illegal for you to lobby is if you are 100% state or federally funded. And so I think local government, you're usually okay, but you should talk to your organization in case there are any policies that they have specifically around lobbying. Ooh, Karen, is signing a resolution lobbying? I actually was just on a lobbying training the other day, and I think that if you're signing on behalf of your organization, it's a good question. Is signing a resolution lobbying? I would lean on the side of if it's just you expressing that you support a certain policy, I would maybe consider it lobbying. Like if it's going to decision makers, that might be considered lobbying. I will check in on that though. That's one that I'll do. Maybe we can add to the list of things to follow up with HRIA folks about, because that's a question I want to get you an answer to. I feel like I saw something recently on a training that said petitions, if you sign a petition, that's technically not lobbying. And so part of me wants to say, no, you're okay. But then I don't want to give inaccurate information. So that one I'll follow up on. All right. So I know that we're beyond 12:30. And so again, these slides will be sent out. Thank you all so much for your engagement. Again, Kate and our information is on the slides, which of course I brought down. So how would you see it? I'm just going to put our email addresses in the chat for folks in case anybody wants to follow up one-to-one about some of these things that we've discussed. And we will stay on for the next 10, 12 minutes or so to answer any other questions that folks might have. But thank you so much.
Also, please fill out the feedback form that's in the chat if you have a minute. Thank you so much.
Any other questions folks have for people who are still on and want some more, like want to think through anything? Yeah, Kathleen.
I have a super quick question.
Yeah.
We share a senator. I noticed that Sal is chair of something about third
bills in the third reading. Yeah.
Yeah. What in the world does that mean?
So it's one of those, and we kind of yada this piece because it's like very specific and you really don't need to like know the specific details of it because the biggest piece is just like, does leadership like it or not? But after a bill is reported favorably out of committee, there's sort of like a series of committees that they go through, but before it perhaps goes to the floor. And bills for committees on the third reading is one of those committees where there's just kind of like a finer tooth comb going through bill language, and it's just kind of like another step, but a bill goes to that committee when it's really close to being brought to the floor. So if your bill is in the committee on the third reading, typically it's not there for very long, like it's a very quick kind of thing. And it usually means that it's like moving very fast, and it's gonna likely go to the floor. And so that is like a committee that's pretty far down along the road.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was it. Thank
Good
you,
question.
everybody. This was so great.
Thank
Definitely.
you. Thanks for your
Keep in touch.
engagement.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye.
Luciano.
Hi, Alexis. Sorry, I'm
No
so
worries.
late,
Sorry.
and I totally missed your answer to, I think it was Karen's question, assigning a resolution lobbying. Can you just repeat your answer for that?
Yeah, so I was saying that one I'm not as positive about. I want to say that it may not be considered lobbying, but at the same time, if the resolution is, if it's around a specific policy, I think at the local level, you might, I think at the local level, you're likely okay. But if it's a resolution for like, let's say like a statewide policy, I'm not really positive. And so what I can do for that is, I was saying, I'm going to follow back up with HRIA to give like an answer that, you know, to give an answer that kind of responds to that. Cause I'm honestly not positive on the resolution, like signing a resolution piece.
If I were to send you the specific resolution, would that be helpful? And
yes, that would be helpful.
Yeah, because I think I'm part of a coalition. We're federally funded and we're state funded, but we wanted to put something in our newsletter to like the people on our listserv, but we weren't sure if we were allowed to resolution, so we decided to pull it out. Someone else the person who sent us the resolution said it's not lobbying, but they didn't explicitly said why it's not lobbying. And I just wanted to I am not a 501c3. We are part of the town, so we're a municipal entity.
Okay.
But if I have your email, so I'll send it to you.
That sounds good. Yeah, no, just send it over, and I can kind of give thoughts. And again, it's not legal advice. I'm gonna clarify that. But yes, yeah, send it over and we can.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions that folks have? Cool. So HRAA team, I don't know if it's